I am a 70-year-old man, and until a few months ago, I believed that age had finally humbled me, that perhaps life had already taught me every possible lesson. But nothing prepared me for the sting of being mocked in my own daughter's home, at my own table by the man she chose as her husband. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw a punch, but his smirk and his words cut deeper than any blade. You know what it feels like when someone looks at you and sees only weakness, when they laugh at your gray hair, your trembling hands, your slow steps, as if the years you carry are nothing but proof that you no longer matter. That was the moment I realized my silence had gone on too long. I have spent my life being careful, being patient, being the man who swallows his pride for the sake of peace. But there comes a day when dignity can no longer be bargained away, when you either rise to defend it or watch yourself disappear in the eyes of those who should love you most. And I have to ask you, if you were me, what would you have done sitting there while your own son-in-law chuckled in front of your daughter, hinting that your time on this earth had already expired? Would you bow your head and pretend not to hear, or would you hold on to the one weapon they never saw coming, the truth you have guarded for decades, a truth hidden in a single letter? The night it happened, I remember the clink of glasses, the polished laughter echoing around that dinner table, and the false sense of family harmony wrapping the air like cheap perfume. My daughter had invited me over. She said she missed me. She said she wanted me to feel less alone since her mother passed. I wanted to believe her, I really did. So I put on my best suit, the one I had not worn since the funeral, and I walked into that house hoping for warmth. What I got instead was humiliation, a performance staged at my expense with her husband as the star. He looked at me as though I were a piece of furniture too heavy to move, yet too useless to keep. He poured me a drink, but the gesture dripped with mockery. He leaned back in his chair, half drunk already, and began to tell jokes that circled around my name, my age, my irrelevance. And my daughter, my own flesh and blood, laughed nervously, caught between discomfort and complicity too weak or too blind to stop him. It was not the first time I had seen arrogance in him, but it was the first time he dared to humiliate me openly. "You know, Dad," he said with that lazy grin, "it must be exhausting pretending you're still in control of your own affairs. Don't worry, when the time comes, I'll make sure you're well taken care of. Maybe a small room somewhere, nothing fancy. After all, what does an old man need?" The words landed like venom. In that moment, I tasted the truth. This man was not simply rude or careless. He was testing the waters, preparing to strip me of my autonomy, maybe even my legacy. He wanted my daughter to see me as a burden, and he wanted me to see myself as disposable. And yet I stayed calm. I smiled faintly, as if I didn't understand his joke, as if my ears were too old to catch his words. Inside, though, I felt something ancient stirring, something that had been sleeping since the day I buried my wife. Here is what he didn't know. My life is not just a string of forgotten days. I have lived through wars, through betrayals, through nights when I thought the sun would never rise again. And over those decades, I learned one thing: above all, power is not loud, power is not obvious. Real power sits quietly waiting, hidden, until the precise moment it must be revealed. That night, as I sat at that table pretending to be a weak old man, I knew I was holding a weapon sharper than any insult he could throw at me. It was folded in an envelope resting quietly in my jacket pocket. A single letter written years ago, updated every few months, and ready to be delivered at the right time. He thought I was powerless, but he had no idea how thoroughly I had studied him, how carefully I had kept track of his arrogance, his shortcuts, his secrets. And that letter, oh, that letter was the key to his undoing. I didn't pull it out that evening. Not yet. Timing is everything. Instead, I let him bask in his little victory, let him laugh, let him puff up his chest, let him believe that he had already crushed the last ounce of dignity left in me. because the sweetest revenge is not served in anger, but in patience. And maybe you think I should have stood up, slammed my fist on the table, shouted him down, demanded respect on the spot. But let me ask you, what good is shouting at a man who already decided you're beneath him? Wouldn't it be far better to let him drown in his own certainty, only to rip the ground from under his feet when he least expects it? That night, as I left their house and walked alone under the streetlights, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer be silent. I would no longer let this man insult the years I carried with pride. And when the time came, he would discover just how wrong he had been to underestimate me. Because you see, I am not just an old man. I am a father who has buried his wife, who has built a life from dust, who has seen kingdoms rise and fall in the span of decades. And the man who dares to mock me at my own table has no idea that his empire is built on cracks. I have documented cracks I can expose with nothing more than a signature on that letter. So when you hear me say that I ruined his career with one piece of paper, know this: it wasn't rage that guided me. It wasn't spite. It was justice, long delayed, now finally delivered. And the story of how it all came crashing down begins with that smirk across the dinner table, the smirk of a fool who thought an old man had no teeth left to bite. There was a time when I believed in the sanctity of family dinners, when the clatter of forks and the aroma of roasted chicken meant safety, belonging, and laughter. Those were the years when my wife was alive, when my daughter was still a girl with bright eyes and scraped knees, when every holiday felt like a small miracle we created with our own hands. It's important that you understand this before you judge my silence later on, because once I truly believed my family was unbreakable. My wife and I met when the world was still raw, when I had nothing but calloused hands and restless ambition. Together we built a life from scratch. We worked through winters with broken heating, summers with leaky roofs, and countless nights when the only dinner we could afford was bread and soup. Yet through it all, there was joy. We never had much, but what we had was ours, earned with dignity. And we swore to pass that dignity down to our daughter. When she was born, I remember holding her tiny hand in mine and whispering a vow that I would always protect her no matter how old she grew. She was my only child, and every decision I made, every extra hour at work, every sleepless night, was for her future. I saved for her education long before she could spell her own name. I fixed her bicycles, patched her clothes, and wiped away her tears after the inevitable heartbreaks of adolescence. She was my pride, my legacy, my reason for enduring. And when she grew into a young woman, intelligent and determined, I allowed myself to hope that my job as a father was nearly complete. My wife and I dreamed that she would meet someone kind, someone who would love her the way we had loved each other. So when she first brought home the man who would become her husband, I tried to open my heart. He shook my hand firmly, he smiled with practiced charm, and he spoke the right words at the right time. I will admit now I was cautious. There was something rehearsed about him, something polished that didn't quite fit with our simple world. But I buried my unease because my daughter's happiness was written all over her face. At the wedding, I remember standing with my wife as we watched them exchange vows. My daughter glowed in her white dress, her voice steady, as she promised to love and honor him. He looked confident, too confident perhaps, but in that moment I dismissed it as the enthusiasm of youth. We danced, we toasted, and when I gave my speech I said that I trusted this man with the most precious thing I had ever created. I believed I was passing her into safe hands. How wrong I was. In those early years of their marriage, there were moments of harmony that almost convinced me I had been too suspicious. They bought a house, they hosted family barbecues. They even asked me to babysit my granddaughter when she was born. And I cherished those days. Holding that baby girl in my arms was like being given a second chance at life, another vow to protect, another legacy to guide. She was the light of my later years, and I thought perhaps this man, my son-in-law, would rise to the responsibility of fatherhood. But time has a way of stripping masks. Slowly I began to notice cracks in the polished image he projected. A cutting remark here, a dismissive gesture there. At first I told myself he was just stressed, that young men under the weight of career and family sometimes grow sharp edges. I chose to forgive, to give him the benefit of the doubt, because I remembered the promise I made at that wedding to trust him, to believe in him, for my daughter's sake. I will never forget one winter when my wife fell ill. She had always been the heart of our home, and her illness shook me in ways I cannot describe. My daughter and her husband came over to help, bringing groceries and warm blankets. For a brief moment, I thought my fears had been misplaced. He carried logs for the fire, he shoveled the snow off the driveway, he even sat with me late at night to discuss treatment options. In those moments, I wanted to believe that perhaps he truly cared, that perhaps he would stand beside us as family. But when my wife passed away, everything shifted. Grief reveals character, and his was revealed in cold, calculated glances. At the funeral, he placed a hand on my shoulder, but his eyes were elsewhere, already measuring the future, already calculating what her absence meant for him. My daughter sobbed in my arms, but he stood slightly apart, his expression not grief, but something closer to impatience. It was as if he had been waiting for this chapter to close, so that a new one more convenient for him could begin. In the weeks that followed, when I was raw with loss, he began to position himself as the decision-maker, the one who would guide my daughter through her grief, the one who would help me manage the home I had lived in for decades. He spoke to me not as a son to a father, but as a man indulging a child with that slow, condescending tone that says you don't understand, but I do, and yet despite the warning bells, I tried to trust him. For my daughter's sake, for my granddaughter's sake. I told myself that perhaps I was being paranoid, that perhaps the weight of widowhood was making me too sensitive, too suspicious. I tried to cling to the memory of those early family dinners, when he still played the role of the caring husband, the attentive father. You see, back then, trust was still intact, or at least I convinced myself it was. I clung to the image of my daughter's smile on her wedding day, the hope in her eyes, the joy of holding my granddaughter. I didn't want to be the bitter old man who tears apart his family with accusations. So I swallowed my doubts, silenced my instincts, and prayed that love would be enough to bind us together. Looking back now, I realize that was the last time I lived under the illusion of harmony, the last time I believed that blood ties and marriage vows could withstand ambition, arrogance, and greed. Because once trust begins to rot, it does not heal. It festers, it spreads, and eventually it poisons everything it touches. If I could go back, I would tell my younger self to pay closer attention to those small cracks, to the glances too cold, the smiles too sharp, the words too rehearsed. I would tell myself that trust once misplaced is a dangerous thing. But at the time, I chose peace. I chose silence. And that silence is what allowed him to grow bold enough to mock me at my own table years later. Yes, there was a time when trust was still intact. And perhaps that is why the betrayal cuts so deeply. Because it is one thing to be mocked by a stranger, but to be mocked by the man you once called family, the man you once trusted with your daughter's happiness, that is a wound that never truly heals. They say hindsight is perfect, that when you look back, all the signs were there from the very beginning. And maybe that's true. Maybe I was blind, or maybe I simply chose not to see because seeing meant admitting that the man my daughter married was not the son I had hoped for, but the snake I had feared. The first cracks didn't appear as explosions, not at first. They came like whispers, like shadows creeping in the corners, so easy to dismiss if you wanted peace more than truth. And God help me, for a long time I wanted peace. The earliest sign was money, though I didn't recognize it then. My daughter asked me once, almost shyly, if I could lend them a small sum. They had bought a bigger house, she said, and the bills had piled up faster than expected. She promised it was just temporary, just until his next promotion came through. I remember the look in her eyes, hopeful, pleading, embarrassed. Of course I said yes. I had worked all my life, not just for myself, but for her, and if she needed me, I would be there. I withdrew from my savings, handed her the check, and told her not to worry. What I didn't know was that the request hadn't come from her heart at all. It had come from him. I realized this one night when I overheard him speaking on the phone. He didn't know I was in the next room rocking my granddaughter to sleep. His voice was sharp, laced with frustration. "Don't worry," he said. "The old man paid up again. He doesn't even ask questions." Those words cut me like glass. The old man. Paid up again. As if I were nothing more than an ATM machine, as if decades of labor and sacrifice had reduced me to a wallet with a heartbeat. But still, I said nothing. I told myself I must have misheard, that maybe he was joking, that maybe I was too sensitive in my grief. That was my mistake, giving benefit of the doubt to a man who had already shown me his contempt. Then there were the remarks, those subtle little jabs dressed up as humor. At family gatherings, he would joke about my age, asking if I even remembered where I parked the car, or if I needed help reading the fine print on a menu. Everyone laughed, including my daughter, though hers was always a nervous laugh, a laugh that tried to smooth over the discomfort. I played along, smiling weakly, telling myself that old age jokes were harmless, that I had thicker skin than that. But the truth is, each remark chipped away at something inside me, something fragile I hadn't even realized was still vulnerable. Another red flag was how he treated my granddaughter in my presence. At first I thought he was just tired, distracted by work. But soon I noticed how his patience with her ran thin, how quickly his voice hardened when she cried, how often he left the room when she needed comfort. I began to see my daughter carrying the weight of the household alone, while he disappeared into business trips that grew longer and more frequent. My instincts told me something was wrong, but again, I buried those feelings. After all, I reasoned, marriage is complicated, and who was I to interfere? The day my wife's jewelry went missing was the day my denial began to crumble. She had kept a small collection of heirlooms pieces handed down from her mother and grandmother. After her passing, I stored them carefully in a box, hidden in my closet, intending one day to gift them to my granddaughter when she came of age. One afternoon, while searching for a photo album, I noticed the box was lighter. 2 rings and a bracelet were gone. My heart pounded as I turned the room upside down, convincing myself I had simply misplaced them. But deep down, I knew. There was only one person who had been alone in my bedroom, recently him. When I confronted my daughter, gently asking if she had borrowed the jewelry, her face drained of color. She stammered, denied it, then changed the subject. That silence told me everything. She knew. She knew, and she was protecting him. Still, I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. Instead, I locked the remaining pieces away in a safe deposit box at the bank, far from his reach. I told myself it was enough that as long as I protected what was left, the damage could stop there. I didn't yet understand that men like him never stop. They only escalate. Another sign came through the whispers of neighbors and acquaintances. People began to tell me they had seen him in places he shouldn't have been, restaurants, with women who weren't my daughter, bars, where he laughed too loudly, always with a drink in hand. When I asked my daughter about it, she brushed it off, said people liked to gossip, that he was just networking for work. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the man she loved couldn't betray her so cruelly. But those whispers burrowed into my mind and would not leave. The final crack before the dam burst came one evening when he drove me home after a family dinner. The air in the car was thick with alcohol fumes, his speech just slightly slurred. As we pulled into my driveway, he turned to me and said, with that same lazy smirk, "You know you're lucky you have me around. Otherwise, who would make sure you don't blow all your money on nonsense? Maybe you should just sign over the house now, save everyone the trouble later." I stared at him in silence, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the effort of holding back my rage. Sign over the house. Save everyone the trouble. As if my life's work was nothing more than a loose end for him to tie up. That was the moment I knew for certain what he wanted. It wasn't just my daughter's hand he had taken. It was my legacy, my home, my dignity. And yet even then I kept my silence. Why? Because I was waiting. Because I knew that confronting him in anger would give him power, but exposing him with proof would destroy him completely. I had already begun gathering those proofs. Letters, documents, receipts, small details he never thought anyone noticed. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. But oh, the patience it demanded nearly tore me apart. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere. The missing money, the cruel jokes, the stolen jewelry, the whispers of infidelity, the arrogance in his tone. Each one was a thread unraveling the fabric of trust. And I sat there watching it fray, pretending not to notice all, while preparing for the day I would pull the final string and let it collapse in his hands. You might ask why I endured it for so long, why I didn't expose him earlier, why I didn't save my daughter from the pain of living with such a man. The answer is complicated. Love makes you blind, not just your own love, but the love you see in the eyes of your child. I didn't want to be the father who shattered her world with accusations. I didn't want to be the one to rip the illusion of her marriage away. So I bit my tongue, I carried the weight, and I waited. But every silence has an end. And mine was approaching faster than he realized, because with each red flag, with each insult, with each theft, I was building a case that would not just silence his mockery, but end his career, his reputation, and every lie he had built around himself. All it would take when the time was right was a single letter. There comes a moment in every long game when silence can no longer serve as protection, but must transform into a weapon. For months, I had swallowed the insults endured, the condescension, ignored the whispers, and played the part of the fragile old man too weak to fight back. He believed that mask. He believed it so completely that he began to expose himself, confident I was incapable of lifting a finger against him. But while he strutted around my daughter's house, mocking my steps and hinting at my supposed incompetence, I was piecing together the truth of his life, and that truth was as rotten as I suspected. The first crack in his own facade came in the form of paperwork, sloppy rushed left carelessly on the dining room table one evening when he stepped out for a phone call. He had been drinking as usual and forgot to tuck away the folder he had carried from work. My daughter was putting the baby to bed upstairs, and I was left sitting there alone with his open briefcase and those papers practically screaming at me. I should have respected his privacy, but after the countless ways he had disrespected me, I felt no guilt as I leaned forward and read. What I saw was enough to make my blood run cold. They weren't just work documents. They were records of deals, contracts with signatures that didn't match, invoices inflated beyond recognition, and expenses listed for services that had never existed. At first I thought I must be misinterpreting, that my tired eyes were inventing patterns that weren't there. But the more I read, the clearer it became. He was committing fraud. Tax fraud, embezzlement, falsification of accounts, layer upon layer of deceit, hidden behind his polished image as a successful professional. I slipped the papers back into his briefcase before he returned my hands steady, though my heart was racing. That night, as I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized the scale of what I had uncovered. He wasn't just a bully. He wasn't just an arrogant man preying on an old widower's weakness. He was a criminal, and criminals eventually face consequences if someone is bold enough to deliver the evidence. That was when the idea of the letter was born. I didn't want to scream at him. I didn't want to confront him with only my words. Words could be twisted, denied, dismissed as the ramblings of an old man. What I needed was something undeniable, something permanent, something that could outlive my own voice if necessary. So I began to write. At first it was a simple account. Dates, times, documents, suspicions. I listed every moment I had witnessed him sneer at my daughter, every evening he returned home late, with the stench of perfume on his collar, every dollar that went missing, every heirloom that vanished. I wrote it all down, line by line, detail by detail. But then I went further. I began to collect copies of his contracts, invoices I quietly photographed. When he left them, unattended emails I managed to access when he forgot to log out of his accounts on the family computer. Slowly, the letter grew into something more than a letter. It became a dossier, a map of his corruption. I kept it hidden in my study, folded neatly inside an envelope marked only with my initials. Every few weeks, I updated it, adding new evidence, refining the language, making it sharper, more precise. I wrote it as if I were speaking to someone who would one day decide his fate, the board of his company, the tax authorities, maybe even the courts. I wrote it so that even if I were gone, even if my voice had been silenced, the truth would remain undeniable. The turning point came one afternoon when my granddaughter, barely 5 years old, climbed onto my lap and asked, "Grandpa, why doesn't Daddy like you?" The innocence in her eyes nearly broke me. Children see what adults pretend not to. In that moment, I knew the letter was no longer just insurance for my dignity. It was a shield for her future. If this man was capable of cheating his clients, betraying his wife, and mocking me without shame, what would he do to her? As she grew older, I could not allow his corruption to poison her world, so I sealed the envelope and placed it in my jacket pocket. From that day forward, I carried it everywhere. It became my silent companion, my hidden weapon. Whenever he smirked at me, whenever he hinted that I should surrender my house, whenever he raised his voice at my daughter, I touched the envelope in my pocket and reminded myself, patience. One day soon, he will fall, and this letter will be the stone that topples him. The early reveal came sooner than even I expected. One evening, after yet another dinner laced with insults, he cornered me in the kitchen while my daughter washed dishes. He leaned against the counter, swirling the last of his whiskey in a glass, and whispered, "You really should think about putting your affairs in order. At your age, one wrong fall, one bad night of sleep, and poof, you're gone. Wouldn't you rather make things easier for your daughter? Sign the house over now, let me handle the rest. You can trust me." I looked him dead in the eye and smiled, but my hand slipped into my pocket and pressed against the envelope. For the first time, I felt ready to let him glimpse what I had. I pulled the letter halfway out, just enough for him to see the thick stack of pages inside, just enough for his smirk to falter. "What's that?" he asked, his tone sharp, defensive. "Just a letter," I said calmly. "Something I've been writing. About you." His eyes narrowed, his hand tightening around the glass. "What do you mean?" I slid the envelope back into my pocket and walked past him, leaving him with the question burning in his mind. For the first time, he looked unsettled, uncertain, even afraid. And in that moment, I knew the balance of power had shifted. He didn't know what I had written, but he knew enough to sense danger. And fear, once planted, grows faster than arrogance. That night was the first time he didn't laugh at me across the dinner table. That night he stayed quieter, glancing at me with suspicion instead of disdain. My daughter didn't notice the change, but I did. I savored it. For months he had toyed with me, believing I was powerless. Now he knew that somewhere in my silence lay a threat he could not control. Of course he didn't back down completely. Men like him never do. Instead, he began to probe, to test the waters, to drop hints, that he wanted to know what I had, how much I had seen, what I might be capable of revealing. But the beauty of a hidden weapon is this: its power lies in the unknown. The more he wondered, the more paranoid he became. And the more paranoid he became, the more mistakes he made. The early twist had been set in motion. The letter was no longer just a secret in my pocket. It was a storm cloud hovering over his head, and he felt its shadow every time he looked at me. He thought he had married into a family with an old, fragile man he could manipulate at will. But what he discovered that night in the kitchen was that the old man was not so fragile after all. The old man had teeth, and the old man was waiting for the perfect moment to bite. Once the letter revealed its shadow, nothing between us was the same. He pretended otherwise, of course. He still smiled at family gatherings, still poured me a glass of wine, with exaggerated politeness, still called me Dad in that rehearsed hollow tone. But behind his eyes I could see it, the unease, the restless calculation, the gnawing question of what I had written and how dangerous it could be. Fear had entered the game, and fear makes men reckless. At first, his paranoia showed in small ways. He started asking pointed questions cloaked as casual conversation. "So, Dad, you've been writing, huh? Must be nice to keep busy at your age. What's it about?" Or, words can be dangerous if people misinterpret them. You wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong idea. I answered each question with the same quiet smile, offering no explanation, no reassurance. The less I said, the more desperate he became. Silence became my weapon, and it drove him closer to the edge with every passing day. But paranoia is contagious. Soon my daughter began to notice the tension. She asked me once in the soft voice of a child caught between two parents, "Dad, what's going on between you and him? Did something happen?" I looked into her eyes and saw the same innocence that had once asked me to lend her money, the same innocence that had once believed her marriage was built on love. I couldn't tell her yet. The truth would have shattered her, and I wasn't ready for that fracture. So I simply said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Some truths take time to come out." She looked at me confused, but she trusted me enough not to press further. Meanwhile, he grew bolder in private. One night after too much whiskey, he cornered me again, his voice low, his words slurred with venom. "You think you can threaten me with some piece of paper? You think anyone will believe the ramblings of an old man? I could make one call, and you'd be declared incompetent. Do you understand? One call, and they'd take everything from you. House money, even your right to sign your own name." I stared at him calmly, the envelope heavy in my pocket. "Then you'd better hope I never make my call first," I said softly. His face twisted, but for the first time he didn't have a comeback. He simply turned away, his hands shaking as he poured another drink. After that night, the escalation came in waves. He tried to dig into my affairs, asking my daughter about my finances, pressing her to convince me to let him help manage things. When that failed, he began to spread rumors among relatives, whispering that my memory was failing, that I was becoming confused, that perhaps grief had made me unstable. I heard the whispers come back to me through cousins, through old friends who looked at me with pity instead of respect. Each rumor was a dagger, but I swallowed the pain because I knew patience would turn those daggers back on him. Then came the attempt to steal outright. One afternoon, I received a letter from the bank informing me of a requested change of ownership on one of my accounts. My hands trembled as I read, but not from weakness, no, from rage. The request had been made in my name, but I had never signed it. Someone had tried to forge my signature, and I didn't need to guess who. I marched into that bank the next morning, presented my identification, and stopped the transfer. The manager, sympathetic, handed me a copy of the paperwork. The forgery was sloppy, rushed, but the arrogance behind it was unmistakable. I placed the document in the same envelope as my letter, smiling, as I realized he had just handed me another nail for his own coffin. The tension seeped into every interaction. At family dinners, he sat stiffly, his laughter hollow, his jokes falling flat. My granddaughter sensed the heaviness, too. She climbed onto my lap, more often hugging me tightly, as if she understood instinctively that something was wrong. She would whisper in my ear, "I love you, Grandpa," and her words gave me the strength to hold steady to endure the storm. But storms, once they gather, must eventually break. The confrontation that set everything into motion came one Sunday afternoon. My daughter had invited me over again, insisting we share a meal as a family. I went not knowing whether it would be another night of humiliation or perhaps a chance for peace. But from the moment I entered the house, I could sense the trap. He was waiting for me, papers spread across the dining table, a smug grin plastered on his face. "Sit down," he said, his tone commanding rather than inviting. My daughter hovered nervously nearby, wringing her hands. I sat slowly, my heart steady, the envelope once again in my pocket. He slid the papers across the table. "These are power of attorney documents. Standard stuff. Just sign here and I'll handle everything for you. Bills, accounts, property. You won't have to worry about a thing." I glanced at the documents. I had seen enough in my life to know what they meant. If I signed, I would cease to exist in every way that mattered. He would own not only my house, but my very name. My daughter's eyes pleaded with me not out of greed, but out of fear, manipulated into believing this was for my own good. I leaned back in my chair, looked him straight in the eye and asked, "And what if I don't sign?" His grin faltered. He tapped the papers impatiently. "Then maybe the courts will decide. Maybe they'll see that you're no longer capable. And maybe you'll lose everything anyway. Do yourself a favor, old man. Make it easy." I reached into my pocket, felt the crisp edges of the envelope, and smiled faintly. "You know," I said quietly, "there's more than one court in this world. And some courts don't need a judge to ruin you." For a moment, silence filled the room. He blinked, confusion flickering across his face. My daughter looked between us, sensing something she couldn't yet understand. And then, for the first time, I saw him hesitate. He leaned back, muttered a curse under his breath, and shoved the papers back into his folder. Whoa. From that day forward, he knew he was no longer the predator circling a helpless old man. He was prey, and he could feel the hunter's eyes on him every time I entered the room. The paranoia consumed him. He drank more, argued with my daughter, more snapped at my granddaughter for the smallest things. His mask was slipping, and the cracks were now visible to everyone. The escalation had reached its peak. He had tried manipulation, forgery, intimidation, and still I stood unbroken, armed with the truth he feared most. He didn't know when I would strike, but he knew it was coming. And that uncertainty was more powerful than any insult he could throw at me. What he didn't realize was that the letter in my pocket had grown into something far greater than a threat. It was now a weapon sharpened by his own arrogance, a weapon ready to cut through every lie he had built. And soon, very soon, the moment would come when I would draw it fully, not just to silence him, but to destroy the empire he had built on deceit. Climaxes rarely arrive with warning. They burst open like a storm tearing through a calm sky, sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. For months I had waited, carrying my letter like a loaded gun hidden in plain sight. For months he had grown more paranoid, more reckless, more desperate to wrest control from me. And then, in one brutal evening, all the waiting ended. The confrontation I had rehearsed in my head countless times finally played out in flesh and blood, and it was every bit as explosive as I had imagined. It began with a phone call. My daughter's voice trembled as she told me I needed to come over right away. "Dad," she whispered, "he's saying terrible things. He says you're losing your mind. He wants me to sign papers to put you under conservatorship. He says it's for your safety." I could hear the tears in her throat. My chest tightened, but my mind was clear. This was it, the moment he had been building toward, the moment I had been preparing for. I put on my coat, slipped the envelope into my inside pocket, and drove through the night with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. By the time I reached the house, I could see the lights blazing in every window, shadows moving behind the curtains like restless ghosts. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with tension. My daughter sat on the couch, her hands clenched around a tissue, her face pale. Across from her, he stood, tall, papers in hand, his expression sharp and triumphant. "There he is," he sneered as I entered. "The man of the hour. Dad, we were just talking about you. You see, it's clear you can't manage things anymore. Your memory, your judgment, it's slipping. Everyone sees it. And I can't stand by while you destroy what little you have left. So we're making things official. A conservatorship. You'll be comfortable, don't worry. We'll make sure you're taken care of." My daughter buried her face in her hands, too ashamed to look at me. He stepped forward, waving the papers in front of me like a flag of conquest. "Sign here, old man. Sign and this whole charade is over. You can rest easy knowing your affairs are in capable hands, mine." For a moment, silence filled the room. I looked at him, then at my daughter, then at the papers thrust toward me. I could have shouted. I could have cursed. But instead I reached slowly into my coat pocket and drew out the envelope. His eyes followed the movement, his smirk faltering. "What's that?" he demanded, his voice cracking with suspicion. I held the envelope firmly, my hand steady. "This," I said, "is the truth. Every lie you've told, every dollar you've stolen, every fraud you've committed, it's all here. Signed, dated, documented. I've been writing for years, watching, collecting. And tonight I think it's time my daughter finally hears who you really are." His face drained of color. He took a step back, his bravado faltering. "You're bluffing," he spat. "You think anyone will believe you? You're senile. Everyone knows it. No one will read your scribbles." I opened the envelope, pulled out the thick stack of pages, and laid them on the coffee table between us. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was louder than thunder. My daughter's eyes widened as she saw the names, the numbers, the evidence laid bare. "Read it," I said to her gently. "Read and see the man you married." She hesitated, her hands trembling as she picked up the first page. As her eyes scanned the words, her breathing quickened. Shock, disbelief, horror, they crossed her face in waves. She flipped to another page, then another, the truth sinking deeper with every line. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of confusion. They were tears of awakening. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers from her hands. But I was faster. I grabbed his wrist with a strength he never imagined I still had, forcing him back. "Don't," I warned, my voice low and steady. "You've mocked me for being old, for being weak. But tonight you'll see just how strong I still am." He snarled, his mask completely gone, his arrogance replaced by raw panic. "You can't do this," he shouted. "I'll ruin you. I'll take everything. You'll do nothing." I cut him off, my voice thundering through the room. "Because while you've been drinking and laughing and sneering, I've been preparing. This letter isn't just for her. Copies have already been sent. To your firm. To the tax office. To the people who will know exactly what you've been hiding." His mouth fell open, his face contorted in rage and fear. "You bastard," he whispered. "No," I said calmly. "Just a father. A father who refuses to be humiliated. A father who refuses to let his daughter live in lies. A father who still knows the value of dignity." The room erupted into chaos. My daughter dropped the papers, sobbing as the truth crashed over her. He cursed, pacing like a trapped animal, muttering threats that grew weaker with each breath. I stood tall, taller than I had in years, feeling the weight of silence finally lift from my shoulders. The confrontation I had dreaded had become the victory I had longed for. The next days moved quickly, like dominoes falling one after another. His company received the documents. Investigations were launched. The whispers that once painted me as senile now painted him as corrupt. Colleagues distanced themselves, friends vanished, his reputation crumbled faster than I could have dreamed. And through it all, I stayed silent, letting the truth speak for itself. But the climax wasn't just about his downfall. It was about the shift in my daughter's eyes. For the first time in years, she looked at me not as a burden, but as the father who had always protected her, even when she didn't see it. She hugged me, her tears wet against my shoulder, and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Dad." I didn't know. I stroked her hair and whispered back, "You weren't supposed to know until the time was right. Now you do. And now you're free." The letter had done its work. It had destroyed his career, shattered his mask, and restored my dignity. It had turned silence into power, humiliation into justice. And in that climactic moment, I realized something I hadn't felt in years: peace. After the confrontation, the world did not change overnight, but it shifted in a way that could never be reversed. For the first time in years, the house felt lighter. The air was no longer thick with mockery and suspicion. Instead, it was filled with silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm when the winds finally rest and the sky begins to clear. He was still there for a few days, pacing, muttering, clinging to whatever scraps of control he thought he had left. But soon, reality closed in. The letters had reached their destinations. The phone calls began. His company launched an investigation. Colleagues stopped returning his messages, and whispers of fraud circled through his professional circles like vultures around a carcass. My daughter saw it all. At first, she wanted to deny it, wanted to believe there was still some misunderstanding. But truth, once unveiled, cannot be hidden again. The documents were undeniable. The timelines, the signatures, the discrepancies, it was all there in black and white. And when she confronted him directly demanding explanations, all he could offer were excuses and rage. He shouted cursed slammed doors, but every outburst only confirmed what the papers had already revealed. The man she had once loved, the man she had once trusted with her life, was nothing more than a liar and a thief. Within weeks, he was gone. He packed his things in anger, leaving behind nothing but debts, broken promises, and the ashes of his arrogance. He stormed out one cold morning, his eyes burning with hatred as he passed me by. For a moment, he stopped at the doorway, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. I thought he might lash out, that he might try one last act of violence. But then his shoulders slumped, and he walked away without a word. That was the last time I ever saw him. My daughter wept for days, torn between the pain of betrayal and the relief of freedom. She held my hand, like she had when she was a child, clinging to me for strength. "Dad," she whispered through her tears, "I don't know how I let it get this far." I looked at her and said the only truth that mattered: you loved. And love makes us blind. But now your eyes are open, and that is enough. Life did not return to what it had been before. How could it? But in the quiet aftermath, something new began to grow. My daughter found work again, pouring herself into her career with a determination I hadn't seen since she was a student. My granddaughter laughed more freely, no longer flinching at raised voices or slammed doors. And as for me, I felt the weight of humiliation and silence finally lift from my shoulders. For too long I had been treated as if I were invisible, as if my years of labor and sacrifice meant nothing. But the truth had restored me. I was no longer the old man mocked at the table. I was the father who had defended his family when no one else would. Sometimes late at night, I sit at my desk and reread the letter. The pages are worn now, the ink faded in places, but the words still burn with the fire of dignity. I keep it not as a weapon anymore, but as a reminder proof that silence can be strength if used wisely. Proof that even in the autumn of life, a man's voice can still change the course of his family's future. I know some will ask, Was it worth it to wait so long, to endure the insults, to let him believe he had won until the very last moment? My answer is yes. Because revenge shouted in anger might have satisfied my pride for a moment, but revenge delivered with precision destroyed him completely. And in the end, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about dignity. It was about teaching my daughter and my granddaughter that no one, no matter how powerful they appear, has the right to strip another human being of respect. And now I turn to you, the one listening to my story. Tell me, what would you have done? If your son-in-law mocked you, stole from you, tried to take your home, would you have stayed silent? Would you have signed away your life just to keep the peace? Or would you have done what I did? Wait, prepare, and strike when the truth was ready to burn through every lie. I ask you because stories like mine are not rare. There are fathers, grandfathers, widowers, men who have given their lives for their families only to be mocked, used, discarded. Maybe you know one. Maybe you are one. And maybe you need to hear this. You are not powerless. Your dignity is not gone. Your years are not a weakness. They are your strength. Inside you lies the ability to turn silence into thunder, to turn patience into justice. If my story has stirred something in you, if it has made you feel the fire of dignity rising again, then don't let it end here. Share what you would have done. Write in the comments. Tell me if you would have waited like I did, or if you would have fought differently. Say 9 if you believe that dignity is worth more than money, more than comfort, more than the lies of those who pretend to love us, because this is not just my story. It belongs to every man who has ever been underestimated, every elder who has ever been mocked, every father who still carries the strength to protect what truly matters. I am 70 years old, and I may not have many years left. But I can tell you this, I will leave this world with my head high, not bowed in shame, not broken by the arrogance of younger men who think age equals weakness. I will leave knowing that I fought, that I stood, that I reclaimed the dignity they tried to steal. And if my story reaches you, if it makes you pause, if it makes you remember the worth of your own voice, then perhaps it will live on longer than I do. Because in the end, all we truly leave behind is not money or property, but the example of how we carried ourselves. My wife taught me that. My daughter will remember it. My granddaughter will inherit it. And now you have heard it too. So I ask you one final time, what would you have done?